New York to London in under 3.5 hours, cruising at twice the speed of sound, 18 kilometers up, high enough to see the curvature of the earth, fast enough to outrun the sunset. Passengers drank champagne at 2,180 kilometers per hour. This was not a concept. It was a scheduled airline service. You could buy a ticket. And then in 2003, it stopped. Not replaced by something faster, replaced by nothing. More than 2 decades later, every airliner in the sky is slower than a plane designed in the 1960s. We are used to technology only moving forward. Concorde is the great exception, the future that got recalled. And the reason it failed tells you more about how the world actually works than any success story ever could. Concorde was born from national pride as much as engineering. In 1962, Britain and France, both watching American dominance of the jet age, signed a treaty to build a supersonic airliner together. Not a company contract, an international treaty, deliberately written to be almost impossible to cancel. The engineering was, and remains, astonishing. A delta-winged needle that cruised at Mach 2.04. A fuselage that stretched by centimeters in flight as friction heated the skin. Engines with computer-controlled intakes that slowed supersonic air to subsonic speeds before it hit the turbines. 1960s computing, doing something fighter jets struggled with. 16 countries' airlines optioned over 70 aircraft. The future seemed booked solid. The Americans rushed to respond with their own program. The Soviets flew their Tu-144 first in a Cold War sprint. Concorde entered service in 1976, London and Paris to Washington, then New York. 3.5 hours across the Atlantic. Businessmen left London in the morning and arrived in Manhattan by the clock earlier than they departed. The marketing wrote itself. Arrive before you leave. But by the day of that first commercial flight, the order book had already collapsed. Every airline except British Airways and Air France had walked away. Only 20 Concordes were ever built, 14 flew commercially. The plane worked. The world it was designed for had already vanished. What happened? 3 things killed Concorde's business case before it ever carried a paying passenger. And none of them was the technology. 1. The boom. A sonic boom isn't a single event at takeoff. It's a continuous carpet of noise dragged along the ground beneath the entire supersonic flight path. Windows rattle. Livestock panic. After test campaigns, including deliberately booming Oklahoma City for months in 1964, which generated thousands of complaints and damage claims, the United States banned civil supersonic flight over land in 1973. Other countries followed. Do the math on what that ban means. Concorde's speed advantage only exists over water. The world's most valuable air routes across America, across Europe, across Asia were suddenly off the table. A plane designed for the world's airways was legally confined to, in practice, one viable market, the North Atlantic. 2. The fuel. Concorde was designed in an era of cheap oil. In October 1973, the same year as the overland ban, the oil crisis quadrupled fuel prices. Concorde burned roughly 4 times more fuel per passenger than the new Boeing 747. Which brings us to 3. The 747 itself. While Britain and France bet on speed, Boeing bet on scale, 400 seats, cheap per-seat costs, falling ticket prices. The industry's future turned out to be mass access, not elite velocity. Concorde carried about 100 passengers who paid many times the normal fare. The 747 carried 4 times as many who paid a fraction. In economic terms, it wasn't a race. It was a category error. The governments knew. By the mid-70s, internal assessments showed the program could never recoup its costs, which had overrun by an order of magnitude into billions. But the treaty had no exit clause, and two nations' prestige was welded to the airframe. So the state absorbed the loss, sold the planes to the flag carriers for a token sum, and Concorde flew on a monument that happened to serve champagne. Here's the twist in the fall. For a while, Concorde actually made money. In the 1980s, British Airways discovered its passengers didn't know what a ticket cost. They guessed higher than the actual price. BA raised fares to match the guess. Concorde became a profitable luxury shuttle for bankers and celebrities, a flying private club whose development costs someone else had already eaten. Roughly 2.5 million passengers flew BA's Concorde over the years. As an asterisk business, the little fleet worked, as long as nothing shook the formula. Then everything shook at once. On July 25, 2000, Air France Flight 4590 struck a metal strip on the runway at Paris. The ruptured tank fire brought the aircraft down with 113 deaths, Concorde's first and only fatal crash. The fleet was grounded for over a year. It returned to service in 2001. Days before September 11th collapsed exactly, the market Concorde lived on: premium transatlantic business travel. Meanwhile, Airbus, successor to the manufacturers, priced ongoing maintenance support for a 14-aircraft, 1960s vintage fleet at a level that made continuation absurd. Air France and British Airways retired Concorde in 2003. The final flight, in October, circled over London as crowds wept on the ground. Every airframe went straight to a museum, the only airliner in history to go from active service to exhibit, fleet-wide, in a single step. So why did Concorde fail? Not engineering, it performed as promised for 27 years. Concorde failed because its designers answered the question, "Can we?" before anyone answered for whom. It was a marvel optimized for a customer, the masses at supersonic speed, that regulation and fuel economics erased before entry into service, leaving a niche too small to sustain an industry. The 747 was the humbler machine and the greater revolution. It asked what most people wanted: cheap seats, and bent metal around that answer. But this file has an epilogue still being written. In 2025, a startup called Boom Supersonic flew a demonstrator past Mach 1 over the U.S., producing, at altitude and under the right conditions, no audible boom at ground level. In 2026, the FAA formally moved to replace the 53-year blanket overland ban with a noise standard. Airlines have ordered around 130 of Boom's planned overture jets. Whether it works technically, financially, is unproven. Which reframes Concorde's obituary. Maybe it wasn't the wrong idea. Maybe it was the right idea, wrong half-century, killed by a regulation written for its own sonic signature. The recall of the future may yet be recalled. Progress, it turns out, isn't a straight line. Sometimes it's a boom followed by a very long silence. Next file: 9 million empty houses. Why Japan, my home base, is filling with ghost towns, and why your country is next. Subscribe.